Voters have spoken, and now it's time for lawmakers to regulate medical marijuana.
The deadline to draft regulations is July 1st. Licenses go out in October. But as First Alert 6 Brian Masterby reports, the Attorney General who opposes it is urging lawmakers to do nothing.
In November, 7 of every 10 Nebraskans, Democrats and Republicans, let their ballots do the talking with an overwhelming yes to legalize medical marijuana in the state. And yet families of youngsters who continue to have debilitating epileptic seizures still face hurdles.
It's been 11 and a half years. This is the 12th legislative session. What's unfortunate, what's disturbing, what's really sad is that we're here again today, feeling like we have to beg.
Before the election, Nebraskans for Medical Marijuana withstood a last-minute court fight to throw out the case. While it's on appeal, lawmakers are now tasked with turning the vote into legislation and regulation. Who can sell it? Who can buy it? But on the eve of the debate, Nebraska's Attorney General Mike Hilgers and U.S. Senator Pete Ricketts wrote an opinion piece in the Omaha World-Herald urging lawmakers to do nothing, to ignore the will of the people, to essentially let the issue twist in the wind with the hope that other courts will one day agree with them.
The individuals who are continuing to bring in opposition, who are absolutely disregarding the fact that 71% of people in this state support safe and regulated medical cannabis. And I would ask them to take a look at almost any state in the nation who has rolled out and legalized medical cannabis for patients. And I'd like them to see that their arguments hold no weight.
Nebraskans for Medical Marijuana gathered in the Rotunda today to make clear their expectations and to remind lawmakers the same people who voted for medical marijuana also voted for them.
A huge problem that we're having right now is that the Attorney General's office is not giving any guidance to law enforcement across the state, to healthcare practitioners, and so hopefully this legislation addresses a lot of that.
Senator Ben Hansen of Blair, a Republican and sponsor of one of the bills, responded to the AG's suggestion that lawmakers do nothing. He told the committee it's his duty and the duty of lawmakers to regulate medical marijuana. In Lincoln, I'm Brian Mastery, First Alert 6.
Senator Hansen told his colleagues that it's up to lawmakers to create the rules and warned that if they do nothing, the executive branch, who is opposed to medical marijuana, would draw up the regulations by appointing the members of the board who will be overseeing it.